Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Celie Hatton, and today I'm joined by our North America correspondent, Anthony Zurcher. Anthony, we're looking at the wide-ranging claims of election fraud that were laid out by President Trump in a rare national address, from meddling by China to allegations of a deep state cover-up. I know the BBC's been reviewing documents that have been newly released by the Trump administration into these claims. Has there been any proof that's been revealed?
Well, Donald Trump has declassified a range of different documents going over the past 5 or 6 years. And he, in his speech to the public, cited those documents. We've had a chance to look a little deeper into them. And some of the information is new, but it doesn't contain any big surprises. There were things that we already knew, some documents that had already been released out into the public domain, some which had been a concern for American governments going back more than 10 years. So the validity of these documents, these are findings, sometimes temporary findings or preliminary findings, but Donald Trump has been grouping all of them together, and in the speech was trying to present it as a clear threat to American elections and warning that things had to be done to secure them or the United States democracy would be in peril.
Okay, so Donald Trump was trying to present this as a threat. Are voters buying it? What's been the reaction so far?
You know, if you look at polls, because this is not new, Donald Trump's claims, he has obviously complained about the 2020 presidential election and his defeat in that election since the day of that election. He has complained about the midterm election, even the 2016 election in which he won. He said there was fraud there, and that's why he didn't win the popular vote. And he has convinced, I would say, a majority, according to polls, of Republicans that there is a problem with election fraud and that he really did win the 2020 election. But the public writ large, beyond Donald Trump's loyal base, I think they view this skeptically. And honestly, they don't think that much about past elections. I think if you look at what voters are concerned about right now, it's the economy, it's affordability, the cost of housing, the cost of energy, and that is what is a pressing concern for them. So Donald Trump talking about this, it's essentially preaching to the choir to some extent. The people who believe this already are going to believe it just as much. But I'm not sure, because of the evidence that he's putting forward over the past 24 hours, that's going to change a lot of minds.
It's fascinating, this split that we're seeing between what the public believes, what polls tell us about what the public believes, and what we're hearing in Washington and what Republicans are saying in Washington. Can you tell me more about that reaction in D.C. between Republicans, but also from Democrats?
Well, Donald Trump, back in 2020, when he was challenging those election results, he had people in his administration who disagreed with him. People like William Barr, the Attorney General, who said that these allegations of voter fraud, widespread voter fraud, was essentially BS. This time around, Donald Trump is surrounded by people in his administration who either agree with him that election fraud is a major concern, or at the very least are willing to echo his statements about calling into question past election results. So it's a different environment here for Republicans, and you've heard it when a whole litany of nominees that Donald Trump has put up for senior administration officials, when they get on the Hill, they're asked by Democrats who won the 2020 presidential election, and almost to a person, they'll refuse to speak on the record to that. They'll not directly answer that question. Most recently, the nominee for Director of National Intelligence, he was unwilling to say that Joe Biden won. He just said Joe Biden was certified as the president, and that was about as far as he was willing to go. So that kind of shows you the environment among Republicans here in Washington. Democrats, obviously, they're saying this is an obsession of Donald Trump's, that he was not willing to accept defeat in 2020. But there's a greater concern that Trump's criticisms, and his speech last night was part of it, is laying the groundwork for his efforts to contest the midterm elections, midterm congressional elections that will take place in November. They say he might later on try to nullify those results or take steps to to block the seating of members of Congress, Democrats who win in some of these races. And the concerns, obviously, they will point back to 2020, when a lot of people after that November election thought Donald Trump was just letting off steam and he was complaining about his loss, but he wasn't going to do anything about it. And then January 6th happened, the rally on the ellipse and the attack on the U.S. Capitol, and evidence that Donald Trump was seriously considering confiscating voting machines and all of these other steps. So I think that has changed the way a lot of Democrats look at these attempts by Donald Trump to call into question the legitimacy of America's democratic election systems.
So, Anthony, let's talk more then about the strategy behind Donald Trump's assertions about past elections and how they might bleed into concerns about future elections as well.
One of the things he did in his speech on Thursday night was make a direct pitch for some legislation that is going through Congress right now called the SAVE Act. And that legislation, which is currently stalled in the U.S. Senate, would effectively ban mail balloting voting, which Donald Trump alleges is rife with fraud, although there's no support for that assertion. Also require proof of citizenship to register to vote. You have to show up with a passport or a birth certificate. And if your name doesn't match that birth certificate, some sort of proof of a name change, whether it was because of marriage or something else. And then also mandatory photo identification to cast a ballot. A lot of states do that already, but this would create a nationwide standard for photo identification when you vote.
Why is this legislation stalled? If Republicans in D.C. are basically lining up behind Donald Trump to support his claims about possible interference in elections, why is this particular piece of legislation not sailing through?
It's passed the House of Representatives, where Republicans tend to vote more in line with Donald Trump. In the Senate, however, it's not universal, the Republican support for this. There are a handful of Republicans who have doubts about this and worry about things like what married women would be able to, whether it would be easy for them to register to vote, the costs associated with finding a birth certificate and getting a copy of it. All of these are obstacles, hoops that you have to jump through in order to exercise your constitutional right to cast a ballot. And so it makes it more onerous for people to exercise that right. And at this point, Democrats are unified in their opposition to this. So their view is that a lot of the people on the margins, people who are new citizens, people who are elderly, who may not have access to old birth records or may not have passports, that they're the ones who are going to be the most affected. And just because they are on those margins and they don't have the documents, they shouldn't be less able to participate in democracy than those of us who have passports and have photo IDs and can very easily get to polling places.
I want to kind of zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture, the bigger reaction, because Donald Trump was very clear in his late night television address. He said that China was responsible for election meddling. And I wonder how this might affect his administration's attempts to patch up relationships with China. I mean, we've already heard from the Chinese Foreign Ministry saying that these claims are malicious smears. So does this kind of go against what Donald Trump's trying to achieve when it comes to China and China trade?
I think it puts it at risk. Trump was pretty blunt in his speech last night. He called it sinister election meddling that China was doing, that China didn't want him to be reelected in 2020 and not only got access to voter rolls, voter data, but also pressured business leaders and used social media to try to influence and turn the public against him. Whether that is going to be a problem going forward, I think depends on what Donald Trump does next. He's made these big allegations against China. Is he going to follow through with that? Does he really believe that China presents a threat to American democracy? Or was that just a tool that he was using to try to get this legislation through Congress that would require greater security on voting, more proof of identification and citizenship, which isn't even really directly related to what China was alleged to be doing. So in some way, it feels like he brought up China to create a feeling of a more urgency, more of a threat to American democracy, but then pivoted to the kind of domestic election security steps that have nothing to do with the kind of meddling that he's accusing China of doing. There's real tension between the United States and China over things like trade and global security. And this is just going to be one more piece of that. But I wouldn't be surprised if we hear from Donald Trump going forward when he talks about China and talks about Xi Jinping, who he is very friendly with in his comments, whether that doesn't change at all. And if that doesn't change, I think that does tell us that this was essentially just trying to find evidence to pursue a domestic goal.
Thank you, Anthony. Our North America correspondent, Anthony Zurcher. And if you want to hear more from the Global News Podcast, click the link below. I'm Celia Hatton. Thanks for watching.